Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show. I'm Barbara Albert, the co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specialising in the development of climate action strategies. And joining me today is Robyn Sefiani, CEO of Sefiani Communications Group. There has been so much focus on net zero in the past 12 months. So from a communications perspective, it is difficult to differentiate your net zero journey from everyone else's. In today's show, Robyn will shed light on best practice examples and insights for communicating your net zero journey. With a public relations career spanning 3 decades, Robyn is a specialist in corporate and brand reputation management, strategic communication counsel, issues management, crisis communication, and crisis management. Robyn established Sefiani Communications in 1999, and since then, she has built Sefiani into one of Australia's leading strategic communications consultancies. Hi, Robyn, and welcome to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a delight to be here.
Thank you. Tell us about your business and where that intersects with sustainability and climate change.
So Sefiani is a strategic communications firm, and we've been operating successfully for 21 years. Our purpose is to help companies enhance their brands and reputations through good communication. And we also protect companies when things go wrong through issues and crisis management. But at the heart of what we do is helping organisations tell their story to their various stakeholders. And that can include employees, customers and clients, shareholders, governments, advocacy groups and regulators.
So how important is climate change for your clients and also for the customers and staff and other stakeholders of your clients?
Climate change has become far more important in recent years. You know, I've been in this business a long time, and I remember working with chemical and steel producers back in the 80s and 90s when things were going wrong, and they were able to get away with it. That's not the case anymore. The power of consumers and the power of shareholders has really pushed organisations into a much more responsible position, and the need to move towards net zero emissions, demonstrate to stakeholders that you're acting responsibly, you're on a path that you need to be, has become vital. And communications plays a really important role in that, because on one hand, you've got the companies doing the deed, you know, making the changes, but on the other hand, they've got to be telling people what they're doing. So it's really a combination. And there is no doubt that the topic of sustainability has become very important.
Definitely. So what does showing up for climate mean?
Well, it means that companies need to act with integrity. They need to make a decision, and this is typically at the board level. They need to make a decision on what they're going to commit to. They then need to tell people about that, and then they've got to implement it. So having a clear, concise plan in line with the Paris Agreement is the starting point. And then demonstrating proof of action at regular points along the journey with frequent communication and initiatives to let people know that they're delivering on their promise. And in communications, we use the word transparency a lot. So being transparent and authentic is really important, because in the days now of social media, people anywhere can see if a company is not doing the right thing, and they can go onto Twitter or YouTube with a video, or Facebook or any other social platform and out an organisation. So it's no longer just journalists and regulators that can report a company for misdeed. It is ordinary members, ordinary citizens or employees who might be disgruntled with an organisation not living up to its words. So the other thing that we're noticing that companies are doing very well increasingly is giving their stakeholders a role in the journey. So involving their employees or their customers. And I'll talk to that later about some great examples that I'm seeing of organisations doing that.
Great. You mentioned earlier the Paris Agreement. Right around the time that the Paris Agreement got signed by most countries, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, or global goals got released as well. Do you see many of your clients communicating their sustainability journey through the lens of those SDGs?
Well, yes, but I think in a very practical way. So let's talk about IKEA. Which I think is a shining global example of a company that's truly living its sustainability values and commitment. You might remember around the time of Black Friday, toward the end of last year, IKEA launched a very clever global campaign, and it was called Buyback Friday. So IKEA offered its customers around the world the opportunity to sell used IKEA furniture back to IKEA, that IKEA would then double the value of the furniture at the time and have it fixed before reselling the piece under the name of the previous owner. So this was really showing how you can recycle furniture. And it aligned the values of IKEA with its audiences, because consumers now increasingly are spending money with companies whose values are aligned with their own values. And IKEA was fighting back against the mass consumerism of Black Friday, which is just a shopping frenzy. So because IKEA put a spotlight on this big environmental issue of like our throwaway society. You know, a lot's been talked about throwaway clothing and throwaway furniture. So here was IKEA actually confronting this issue head on, because, you know, they have also been accused of having furniture that may not last and it's thrown away. So here they were tackling that head on and actively engaging with their customers to bring the consumers on the journey to help do the right thing by the planet. And by doing this, they differentiated IKEA from other furniture brands, and they had a platform that just stormed social media globally, and everybody was talking about it. So, you know, it's a very clever example of a company coming up with a great idea to bring customers on this climate change journey, educate customers along the way, show the world that you are actively, seriously moving in the right direction, and differentiating yourself from competitors.
That's such a great case example, IKEA. I'm a big fan of them myself. So we've looked at the external factors driving organizations. You've mentioned IKEA as a great case example. How do you recommend companies go about planning and implementing their own journey to net zero?
Well, it has to start at the top. And interestingly, I think that it starts then with employees. So if the board of an organisation decides we must do this, and often that's driven by investor sentiment, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more, Barbara.
I have a question or two.
Companies need to bring their employees on the journey. And I think it's fair to say that younger employees are now choosing to work with organisations that are doing the right thing. And younger people care about the planet, possibly more than older people. You know, I think research is showing that millennials and Gen Z really care about the planet, and they want to know that the company they're working for is moving towards net zero emissions. So I think that once a company has made that decision, they need to communicate internally first. The other thing is employees can be your biggest advocate. So they're going to talk positively about a company that they're proud of because, you know, you've made that alignment to the Paris Agreement. And we also know increasingly that companies have what we call a glass box culture. So you can't pretend you're going on this journey towards decarbonisation unless your actions are backing up your words. So that's a really important point to be mindful of. And then we know that procurement, I mean, I know as a provider of services to global organisations, you know, the supply chain is now an important part of the procurement decision. So you have to be able to demonstrate to your major customers that you are a sustainable business, that you're mindful of the need to be moving towards decarbonisation, and can you cite some examples of what you're doing? So I will talk briefly about one of our global clients at Sefiani that we're very proud to represent, and it's the L'Oreal Group. So L'Oreal is the world's biggest beauty company. And they have for many years had a big commitment to sustainability, decarbonisation. They're a French-based company. They've signed up to the Paris Agreement. And last year, they made a major global announcement committing to 2030 sustainability targets. The way they did that was to have a global media conference. So, of course, it was happening during the height of COVID. Nobody could be together in a room anywhere. And so L'Oreal organised a global media conference with journalists all around the world, able to listen in to the significant announcement, which was a declaration from the chief executive and president of L'Oreal that by 2030, the company would achieve 100% carbon neutrality, 100% renewable energy by 2025. These targets included a 25% reduction in CO2 emissions from the use of their products and a 50% reduction on the transport of their products. So their products are made all around the world. And this really means that their supply chain also has to come along on this journey.
We're certainly seeing this in our company as well. Like previously, there was a big focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, so direct emissions and the consumption of electricity. But increasingly, there is a bigger focus now being placed on scope 3 emissions, which are all about the supply and value chain.
Yes, and I mean, one thing that really struck me is that L'Oreal is even looking at how they make shampoo, so that to use less water, they're going to be looking at formulations of dry shampoo. So it's really testing the cleverness of their scientists and their chemists who are producing these beauty products to do things differently. And one thing I really love is L'Oreal does no animal testing, no live animal testing for its beauty products. So their scientists have developed artificial skin, and they're now testing beauty products on artificial skin instead of live animals. So that's just another example of its broader commitment to sustainability. So from a communications standpoint, which is where my company comes from, we worked with L'Oreal and Julie Bishop, Australia's former foreign minister, who is a consultant to the L'Oreal Group. And our job was to help articulate L'Oreal's commitment through the Australian media. So we arranged an interview for Julie Bishop with Vogue, with Network 10, and other sustainability-based media to really articulate L'Oreal's climate change commitment. And the next step for that was L'Oreal organised a very interesting live event broadcast with Craig Rucastle, who you might know is the
Definitely.
former member of the Chaser,
Yeah.
who is a passionate environmentalist in the war against waste, and held a live event broadcast in Australia addressing these issues and focusing on the positive commitments of the L'Oreal Group. So there are many ways to communicate what you're doing, but it has to be compelling and different, because otherwise you're just one voice of many voices.
L'Oreal is such a great example, like you said, about an all-encompassing view, a holistic view on sustainability, which is great to see. But in terms of trends for other corporates, are there any other trends that you see for corporates and how they differentiate themselves, how they become leaders, how they position themselves, and how they act on climate change?
So one thing we're seeing a lot of is that companies are having to learn. You know, the world is changing, societal expectations are changing, investor demands are changing rapidly. So companies are learning as they're going along. They're learning to operate in new ways. At the same time, they're facing some significant challenges, and whether that's defining new funding models to tackle the costs of decarbonisation, or offloading carbon heavy legacy assets, something that we're seeing as well. So the question that these companies are having to really confront is what to communicate, when to say it, where and how. So do companies keep quiet as they're going on this journey, or do they call it out and hold themselves publicly accountable? And I think that's the interesting balance that we're seeing. I think to give an example, last year BHP made an announcement about responsible steel. You may remember that. And they were really looking at the whole life cycle of steel production, and as far as resourcing, production, the use of recycled steel, and this is all part of their path to decarbonisation. So I think once a company makes a public commitment, they've got to live up to it.
Yeah, that would be a big mistake to make the commitment and then not live up to it. That would be horrible. But what I find is that there has been so much focus on net zero and climate action. It seems that everyone's now making commitments to go net zero and or 100% renewables. And as a company, you always have to communicate your efforts, but you are in a congested marketplace because everyone's competing for these announcements and for the achievements that they've made. How can you differentiate yourself as a company? How can you communicate clearly to the marketplace about your specific journey? How do you get media attention in such a congested environment?
Well, look, the truth is the media are not all that interested unless you are doing something completely different, because all organisations are now, all responsible organisations are now moving on this path, and what makes news is something that's the first. So which is why the BHP responsible steel announcement made big news, because it was the first of its kind. So news is all about being first, or being timely, or the context of other things that are happening in the world at the time. So I think the trick is, from a communicator's point of view, how do you help an organisation make its journey newsworthy? And so that's where we really have to work with companies to maybe bring it to life. And I think that IKEA example is a great one. And then another example, going back to our client L'Oreal, they actually sponsor the Women in Science Awards in conjunction with UNESCO. And last year, the awards focused on female scientists doing great work in climate change initiatives. So there's another example of create an asset or create a piece of thought leadership that isn't just about you as the company, but it's something you're doing to advance the cause for the planet. So by highlighting the great work that Australian women scientists are doing in the area of climate change, and it's got the L'Oreal brand attached to it, and L'Oreal is providing the funding for further research. It's not all about L'Oreal, it's about these wonderful female scientists and the great research they're doing to come up with new initiatives to help companies move on toward the net zero commitment. So I think it's finding opportunities to make what you're doing relevant to broader society.
Definitely. Now, you mentioned a few strategies on how you can differentiate yourself, but what if it goes wrong? What if you say the wrong thing and it just goes completely pear-shaped? What do you do? Have you got an example of where this happens, and what's your recommended strategy?
Well, that's where issues and crisis management comes into play, which is actually my area of expertise. Look, a company just has to move past that. You've got to apologise. You say, okay, we got it wrong, and this is what we're now doing. So I think, my advice to organisations when they're in difficulty, when their brand or reputation is at risk, you have to acknowledge what's happened. You've then got to say, well, this is what we're going to do to address it. And this is our commitment. And then you've absolutely got to live up to that commitment, because everyone's eyes are on you. And that's a reality.
That makes a lot of sense. So previously we talked about how important transparency is and communicating your journey. But then again, these pitfalls could be there if you're communicating wrongly. How do companies judge where to draw the line between being fully transparent with their disclosures and then holding back with some information or making sure that it's communicated properly? How do you recommend companies do that?
Well, transparency and authenticity is always the better way to conduct business. But you then are publicly held to account. So it is a fine line to decide. Definitely my view as a communicator is always to be transparent, to be open, to be accountable. I think where you really notice the mettle of an organisation is where an organisation owns up to a failure. And I think a really good example of that is Charity Water. And they actually acknowledged that they had a problem. They decided to admit that one of their water drilling projects failed after 1 year. The head of Charity Water openly conceded defeat, but he came back with a plan. And I think that was the great strength. So you acknowledge something's failed, but you know what? We know how to fix it, and this is what we're going to do. And then when the team returned to drill a few months later, so many more people around the world were aware of Charity Water. They were aware of the problem, but they were impressed by the fact that the organisation had a plan and they were willing them on to succeed. So, people are human, people make mistakes, companies make mistakes, and I think that forgiveness and a willingness to say, okay, they mucked up, but at least they admitted it. And the good thing is they've got a plan to fix it, because I think trying to cover up and pretend something hasn't happened, or even worse, make untrue promises or untrue claims and then be found out, that's a much bigger reputation problem.
Definitely. And it's such a nice segue into my next question, which is all about the customers and clients of businesses. So you mentioned Charity Water as a great example. But I'm wondering, is changing consumerism, is it real? Are people really after climate action versus just promises on climate action?
I think I think that's true. It was interesting last night on the news. I think I was watching ABC News, and there was a warehouse full of single wear clothing, which hasn't been sold because through COVID, and it talked about the supply chain impact of women in third world countries who are producing this single wear clothing are now having to. They're either now living in utter poverty or, unfortunately, they're resorting to prostitution to try and earn money to sustain their family. A story like that has a big impact on consumers. So, and I think young women in particular who love posting photos on Instagram of wearing the latest dress, but they can only post one photo once of that dress and then it's gone, it's discarded. So I think for a story that we saw yesterday that hopefully is making its way all over social media to be seen by young consumers, hopefully that resonates. And those consumers are then going to think a little bit more carefully about how they spend their money on clothing and can they spend money on more sustainable clothing. And what I really like, I bought an item of clothing just last week from a shop where the sales assistant was very proud to tell me if I went onto the website that was printed on the label of this cotton top, I could see exactly where the cotton was produced. I could see exactly who worked in the fields, where in the world that cotton was grown. There was absolutely no slave labour. Water was used responsibly, how it was transported. The fact that all this information is now more available to consumers, I think consumers are becoming more educated and more aware, and therefore they will hopefully start making more responsible purchasing decisions, because purchasing power is really important. Just like shareholder activism is really important. And we're seeing so many examples now of shareholders impacting board decisions. As an example there, we know that a member of a large superannuation fund in Australia recently took that fund to court because he didn't believe he was hearing enough information about where that fund was placing its investments. And he, as a young male Australian, wanted to know that his superannuation fund was investing in sustainable businesses and moving towards the right targets in decarbonisation. So people are more educated, and therefore they are more powerful in influencing corporate business decisions about sustainability.
That's really great to hear. So as they become more educated, they would actively seek to purchase from companies that are sustainable, that have made a commitment and are actively working towards achieving net zero emissions, for instance. So that's great. But how much do these consumers want to know about a company's journey? How much are they interested? What do they want to hear?
I think they're increasingly interested, Barbara. And not only that, I think they're increasingly demanding information. The world is just full of information, and with all of our social media channels as well as our traditional media, and now with that example I provided of, the website on the shopping label, on the product label, people are demanding more transparency. And which is such a good thing, isn't it? Because it's holding companies accountable. And I think it then moves into, well, what are the consequences if companies are not communicating and transparent and moving in the right direction on their net zero targets? So two things can happen. One is shareholders can walk away from a company. or shareholders can place pressure on a company's board, and we've seen that happen in a couple of recent instances in Australia, not only on the sustainability subject, but also culture, the culture of an organisation, the fair treatment of women in organisations. And all of this really comes down to, do companies have a social licence to operate? And a social licence really means everything on the environmental scale, on the people and culture scale, on how they're contributing to the benefit of society. So one of the other consequences is something that we call cancel culture.
What is cancel culture?
It's a new term in our field of communications and brand. And it's really where a group of consumers or customers just decide to actively boycott a brand or a company based on what that brand or company has done. And they can do that very effectively on social media. So, and it, you know, it really holds companies to account. So...
And so it should. So how would you go about helping a brand that genuinely wants to commit to net zero and go down that path?
Well, you have to ensure that the company has something compelling to talk about. So as a communicator, we're all about messaging. So really help a company determine what it wants to say. What are the messages it wants to convey? The second thing we do is stakeholder mapping. So that's really looking at who are all the stakeholders that company wants to reach. And that will include its internal audiences, being its employees, its own supply chain, and all its external audiences, which will be customers and clients, government, regulators, advocacy groups, and any other organisations they may want to influence. And so we then map the messages to those particular stakeholders, and the messages might be slightly different to each stakeholder group. The other thing we need to do is we look at, well, what are your competitors doing and saying? So in your industry sector, whether it's technology or telecommunications or manufacturing or mining, what are your competitors saying? And how can you say it better and differently? And that's where we as communicators look for white space, we call it. So it might be an area of thought leadership that nobody else is talking about. Or you might decide to partner with a really credible organisation like L'Oreal has done with UNESCO for the Women in Science Awards. So can you partner with a really highly regarded, credible organisation or not-for-profit to develop an event or asset or award or forum or thought leadership think tank where you can contribute? So it doesn't have to be all about you as the company, but you can be part of a conversation that is moving in a very positive direction. So then how do you look at bringing your audiences along with you on the journey? And let me give you an example of someone that I think's done that really well lately. We all go to supermarkets, right? We all shop weekly in supermarkets. And I think Coles and Woolworths have both made a very good attempt, and they're making visible progress towards being more sustainable in what they're putting on supermarket shelves, but also bringing their customers along on the journey, educating Australians about how we can all be more sustainable. And what I really liked was Coles' recent announcement that they were going to stop stocking single-use plastic tableware and plastic cutlery. And I just thought, hooray, because I'd gone into a Coles supermarket with my partner only a couple of weeks earlier. And we wanted to buy, I think, 4 plastic forks and 4 plastic knives. And, the only thing that was available was like a packet of 100 plastic knives and forks. And I just felt incredibly guilty. I thought, no, I cannot buy that. I think the fact that Coles has this slogan, together to zero. So together meaning the supermarket and the customers. So it's a joint responsibility. I think that's where companies can really help bring customers along on the journey. Don't just talk about talk about we. We're in this together. We're all here to help save the planet.
And that's how the problem needs to be tackled. Everyone needs to work on making sure that we achieve net zero emissions sooner rather than later. So how can organizations that are interested in telling their story, how can they get in contact with you to help, so that you can help them with their journey?
Well, we'd love to help more organisations tell their story. So we have a website at sefiani.com.au, and you can certainly contact us through there. On the people page of the website, my phone number and email address is listed. So, reach out. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. I have opinions about a lot of things that I like to share. So people can certainly connect with me on LinkedIn.
That's great. And we will also put all your contact information in the show notes of this podcast. That was a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for your time, Robyn. Yeah, I gained so many insights.
Lovely to talk to you, Barbara. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye. And thanks also to our listeners for tuning in. I'll see you in the next show. Thanks.